In the autumn of 1879, in the canyon country above the Dolores River in the southwest corner of Colorado Territory, a woman of 28 stood at a sheriff's sale with $2 silver in her glove and watched a man laugh at her before she had spoken a single word. The thing for sale was a Tollbridge keeper's shack, abandoned 11 years, set on a stone shelf above a crossing the river, had long since changed its mind about the bridge. It, once guarded, was gone. The road that fed the bridge was gone. What remained was a low building of squared timber and mortared stone, its roof half fallen, its one window blind with dust, and a back wall that the auctioneer described, with some amusement, as solid rock. Nobody wanted it. The men who had come to the sale wanted grazing land and water rights, and they did not want a ruin perched over a dead crossing where the only thing a person could keep was the wind. So when Adelaide Voss raised her hand and offered $2, the laughter that went around the yard was the gentle dismissive kind, the kind that costs the laughers nothing and is forgotten by them within the hour. She was not forgotten by them. That is the part of the story they would have to live with later, when the shack they had laughed at gave up what it had been holding for 30 years, and the laughter turned to a silence that no apology could fill. That, however, came after. On the morning of the sale, Adelaide Voss was simply a woman with $2, a borrowed wagon, and a reason she did not explain to anyone for wanting a building that even the bank had written off its books. Stay with this one. There is a wall in it that was never what it seemed, and what was behind it had been waiting a long time for the right hands. Adelaide had come to the territory the way many came, which is to say, she had been sent. 3 months earlier she had been turned out of her uncle's house in St. Joseph, Missouri, with one trunk and the clothes she wore. After she refused to sign over a small inheritance her mother had left her in a form her uncle could spend. The form had been a single sheet laid on the dining table one evening after supper, the lamp turned up, a pen set beside it on a folded cloth, as though the cloth made the thing gentler. Her uncle had explained in the patient tone a man uses when he believes the matter already settled, that the money would be safer managed by him, that a woman had no head for sums, that all she need do was put her name at the bottom, and the worry would be his and not hers. She had read the sheet. She had read it twice, the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything before she committed her hand to it, and she had seen in the 3rd paragraph the small clause that turned management into ownership, and she had set the pen back down on its cloth and said she would keep the worry herself. He had called her ungrateful. He had called her difficult. He had told her, in the dry voice of a man counting another person's worth and finding it low, that a woman with no husband and no money and too many opinions would not last a season west of the river. She had not argued with him. Arguing with such men, her grandfather had taught her, was like arguing with a stuck hinge. You did not win it with words. You won it with patience and the right tool and the willingness to work in the cold until the thing gave way. It was her grandfather she carried west, though he had been dead 4 years. Not his body, which lay in a churchyard in Pennsylvania, but his hands, which she felt every time she picked up the tools that had been his, and were now the only thing of real value she owned. Elias Voss had been a stonemason, and in his last decades a builder of dry walls and chimneys and the patient masonry of bridges and cellars and mill races. He had taken his granddaughter into his trade the way some men take a son, not by announcement, but by simply letting her hand him things until the day came when she handed nothing and built instead. He had taught her to read stone the way a fisherman reads water. He had taught her that mortar lies and rock does not. And he had told her more than once the sentence that would matter most in the canyon country above the Dolores, though neither of them could have known it then. A wall that is too thick, he said, is a wall that is hiding something. The shack above the dead crossing had a back wall that was too thick. She had seen it 3 days before the sale. When she rode out to look at the property, the bank clerk had laughed at her for asking about. The crossing sat where the canyon pinched narrow and the river ran fast and shallow over a shelf of pale sandstone. A bridge had spanned it once, a toll bridge built in the years just after the war by a freight company that wanted a shorter route to the silver camps in the high country. The keeper's shack had stood at the eastern end, and the keeper had collected coins from the freight wagons and the riders and the cattle drovers who used the crossing rather than ford the river 40 miles downstream. Then in a single spring, the river had risen, jumped its banks, gouged a new channel a quarter-mile to the south, and left the old crossing high and useless. The bridge timbers were salvaged or rotted. The freight company failed. The keeper, an old man whose name the bank no longer had on file, was said to have died in the shack the winter the road went quiet, and after that no one had any reason to climb the shelf and open the door. No one but Adelaide, who climbed it on a cold blue morning and stood in the low doorway and let her eyes adjust, and who felt, before she understood why, the particular wrongness of the room. It was the back wall. 3 walls of the shack were what a frontier building's walls should be, timber and stone, perhaps 18 inches through enough to turn the wind and hold a roof. The 4th wall, the one set against the canyon side, was nearly 4 feet thick. She knew it without measuring because she had spent her childhood among walls, and her hand knew the difference between a wall that was solid and a wall that merely pretended. She had paced the room twice, heel to toe, and the count did not match the count she made outside along the canyon face. And the difference was the thickness of that one wall, a difference a builder of ruins would have no reason to add. A wall costs labor, a wall costs stone, hauled and mortar mixed, and days a man does not get back. No keeper alive built 4 feet of wall where 18 inches would have held the roof and turned the wind, not unless the wall was meant to do a second thing besides stand. She laid her palm flat against the cold stone of it and felt nothing she could have named to another person, only the same quiet attention her grandfather used to fall into when a thing was not as it claimed to be. She did not say any of this at the sale. She offered $2, absorbed the laughter, paid the clerk her silver, took the paper that made the ruin hers, and drove the borrowed wagon back to the small town of Halloran Crossing, 11 miles downriver, where she had rented a corner of a widow's house for 50 cents a week, and where the widow, a sharp-eyed woman named Pruitt, told her she had bought herself a heap of falling rock and a long walk to look at it. The town's verdict was the same. A young woman alone, exiled by her own family, fool enough to spend half her money on a dead tollkeeper's ruin. The blacksmith, a square man named Coyle, told her flatly that she would not get a wagon up that shelf and that whatever she meant to do with the timber was not worth the hauling, and he said it the way a man states a thing he considers beyond argument, already turning back to his forge before she could answer. The storekeeper sold her a pound of nails and a coil of rope and asked, not unkindly, whether she had people who could come help her. She told him she did the work she could do, and she did it alone, and she left before he could decide whether to pity her. The widow Pruitt, who knew the canyon better than any of them, told her over supper that the shelf held nothing but wind and rattlesnakes and a roof that had quit 11 years past, and that she had seen newcomers throw good money after worse, and this was the worst she had seen yet. Adelaide thanked her for the supper and said nothing about the wall. A person who has been counted as nothing learns the value of a closed mouth, and she had learned it well. What she did not tell any of them was the reason she had wanted the shack in particular. She had not chosen it for the timber. She had chosen it because of a story she had heard in St. Joseph in the months before her uncle turned her out, from an old freight agent who drank in the same boarding house and who liked to talk about the early routes. He had told her among many things about a tollkeeper on the Dolores who had been robbed of his takings season after season by the company that employed him, a company that recorded his collections at a fraction of their true sum and pocketed the difference, and who, the agent said, had stopped trusting banks and stopped trusting men, and had taken to keeping what was his own in a place no thief and no company clerk would ever think to look. The agent did not know where. He thought the old man had died with the secret. He told it as a sad story about a stubborn fool who had hidden his money so well that he had hidden it from his own heirs. Adelaide had filed the story away the way she filed everything, and when she came west and heard the bank clerk mention a tollkeeper's ruin going to sheriff's sale for back taxes nobody would pay, the two halves of the thing had fit together in her mind with a click she felt in her teeth. She did not believe in luck, she believed in attention, and she had paid attention to a wall that was 4 feet thick, where 18 inches would have done. The morning after the sale, she loaded her grandfather's tools into the borrowed wagon and drove out to begin. The tools were the whole of her inheritance and the whole of her plan. There was a stonemason's hammer with a worn hickory handle that had been sweated dark by her grandfather's grip, and then by hers. There was a set of chisels, a pointing trowel, a heavy iron pry bar, a mason's level with a bubble grown slightly yellow with age, and a 12-pound sledge she could swing for an hour before her arms began to fail. There was also a small soft brush, the kind used to clean dust from a fresh joint, and it was this brush, not the sledge, that her grandfather had told her was the most important tool a mason owned. The sledge takes a wall down, he said. The brush tells you what you are taking down before you ruin it. A careless man swings first. A mason looks first. She looked first. For the whole of the first day she did not strike a single blow. She cleared the fallen roof timbers off the floor and stacked them outside. She swept 30 years of dust and pack rat leavings from the flagstones. She propped the door open and let the cold, clean light into the room, and she studied the back wall the way her grandfather had taught her to study any work of another mason's hand, reading it for the story of how it had been built, and by whom and in what state of mind. What the wall told her was that it had been built twice. The lower courses, up to about the height of her waist, were old and true, laid by a careful hand in the years the bridge was new, the stones well chosen and the joints tight. Above that, the work changed. The upper courses were laid by the same hand, but in haste and in secrecy, the stones less carefully matched, the mortar mixed thin and applied thick, the whole face of it furred over later with a skim of clay and lime, meant to make the new work look as weathered and old as the rest. To an ordinary eye, it was one wall, dirty and plain. To Adelaide, it was a confession. Someone had opened this wall, put something inside the thickness of it and closed it again, and had tried to make the closing invisible. She found the seam on the second day. It ran in a faint vertical line a little left of the room's center, where the hasty mortar met the old, and she found it not by sight but by sound, tapping along the face with the back of a chisel and listening the way her grandfather listened for the difference between the dead flat thud of solid fill and the higher hollower note of a void behind. For most of its width the wall answered dead and solid. Then, in a panel perhaps 3 feet wide and reaching from the waist-high old work up to the height of her shoulder, the wall answered hollow. She tapped the edges of the panel and mapped it by ear, marking the corners with a stub of charcoal, and when she stepped back and looked at the charcoal rectangle she had drawn on the cold stone, she understood that the toll-keeper had built himself a chamber in the heart of his own wall, and had walled it shut, and had died with whatever it held still inside. That night, she did not go back to the widow's house. She built a small fire in the shack's old hearth, ate bread and cold bacon, and slept wrapped in 2 blankets on the swept flagstones with her grandfather's hammer beside her, like a thing that might keep her company. She was not afraid. She had been turned out of a house by a man who counted her as nothing, and she had learned that the worst that people could do to her had already been done, and that on the far side of it there was a strange, clean freedom. She lay on the cold floor of a ruin she had bought for $2, and she felt for the first time in months entirely herself. The opening of the wall took her 4 days, and it nearly broke her, and it is worth telling slowly, because the labor was the whole of it, and there was no luck in any part. The skim coat came off first. She worked it with a chisel and the soft brush, taking the false weathering off in flakes and dust, exposing the line where the hasty mortar met the old. She did not swing the sledge. To swing the sledge at a hidden chamber is to risk crushing whatever it guards, and her grandfather's voice was in her hands telling her to go slow, to take the mortar, and leave the stone, to lift the new work out course by course, and learn the chamber by uncovering it rather than by breaking in. So, she chiseled the thin mortar from around the first stone of the false panel, working the iron in along the joints, easing the stone until it rocked, then drawing it out with both hands and setting it on the floor and marking it with charcoal so she would know where it had stood. Then the next stone, then the next. The first day she lifted out 6 stones and her hands bled through the cloth she had wrapped them in. Each stone came the same way. The chisel worked along the upper joint first and then the 2 sides, the mortar coming away in a gray dust that hung in the lantern light and settled on her sleeves and in her hair, and then the slow rocking of the stone in its bed until it loosened, which she had to make with her knees and her back together because the stones were the size of a bread loaf and twice the weight, and the setting down on the flagstone floor with a charcoal number, chalked on the face so the wall could be read backward if it ever needed to be. The second day she lifted 9, and the muscles of her back seized so badly that she had to lie flat on the flagstones at midday, until the spasm passed, staring up at the underside of the new roof timbers she had not yet replaced, breathing slow against the knot of pain. And then she rose and wrapped her hands again and lifted 4 more before the light failed. She ate, standing up. She did not waste the daylight on sitting. On the second evening she had opened a gap the size of a window into the thickness of the wall, and she held her lantern to it and looked in, and saw only darkness and the back face of the chamber, and on the floor of the cavity a shape covered in a rotted blanket. She made herself stop. The light was failing, and her hands were ruined, and she knew that the worst mistakes are made at the end of a long day when the thing is almost in reach. She wrapped her hands again, banked the fire, and slept. And the shape under the rotted blanket waited as it had waited for 30 years, one more night being nothing to it, a word, before the wall gives up what it held. There are people watching this who have been told by someone that they amount to little, and who have gone quiet and gone west in their own way and kept working anyway. If you are one of them, stay close to the end of this. What Adelaide found behind the false wall has something to say to you. On the 3rd day, she widened the gap until she could reach inside, and on the 4th, she lifted out the last of the false stones, and the chamber stood open to the light, and she knelt at its mouth and drew the rotted blanket aside with the care of a woman, uncovering the face of the dead. There was no body. The toll-keeper had not hidden himself. He had hidden his life. Inside the chamber, packed with a mason's neatness into the space he had built for them, were 3 things. The first was an iron strongbox, not large, the kind a freight office used for a day's coin, its lid sealed shut with rust. The second was a flat tin document case of the sort a careful man used to keep papers dry. The third was the keeper's own record, a thick ledger bound in cracked leather wrapped twice in oilcloth against the damp, and it was the ledger she opened first. There on her knees in the cold, because her grandfather had taught her that the proof of a thing matters more than the treasure of it, and a wise hand reads before it counts. The ledger was the toll-keeper's accounting, kept in a cramped, careful hand across 11 years, and it told a story that the freight company had spent those same 11 years telling differently. Every wagon, every rider, every head of cattle that crossed the bridge, the keeper had recorded with the toll collected, and the date, the entries running down the pages in columns so even and so disciplined that Adelaide knew at once she was reading the work of a man who had nothing in his days but this, and folded into the ledger at intervals were the company's own receipts, the slips sent down from the head office acknowledging the sums the keeper had remitted, and the 2 columns did not agree. They did not agree by a great deal. For 11 years the keeper had collected and sent on his takings, and for 11 years the company had recorded receiving roughly half of what he sent, and had pocketed the rest, and had kept the difference in its own books as the keeper's shortfall, building a paper record that made an honest man look like a thief skimming his own till. She turned the pages slowly, season by season, and watched the lie accumulate, watched a single man's careful truth set down month after month against a company's patient theft, and she understood that the keeper had not kept this record to comfort himself. He had kept it as evidence. He had kept it the way a mason keeps a plumb line, because without it, a wall is only a guess, and a man without proof is only a complaint. The keeper had known. That was the thing the ledger made plain. He had known for years that he was being robbed, and he had known that he could not prove it against a company with lawyers and a head office and the ear of the territorial courts. And so he had done the only thing a stubborn, careful, dismissed man could do. He had kept his own true record. He had kept every receipt, and he had taken the portion of his wages he could withhold and the small, honest savings of a frugal life, and he had sealed them with the proof of the theft, inside the one wall in the world that he himself had built, and that he knew no one would ever think to open. He had not hidden his money from his heirs out of madness. He had hidden it from the company that would have taken it, and he had meant for it to be found by someone who would know what they were looking at. Adelaide Voss knelt in the cold and read by lantern light, and understood that she was that someone. The tin document case held the deed to the shack, and the shelf it stood on, made out in the keeper's name, Josiah Renner, a name the bank had lost and the company had erased, and with the deed a letter written in the same cramped hand addressed to no one and to anyone. She read it twice. It was not a long letter, and it was not a bitter one, which made it harder to read. The keeper wrote that he had been called a thief by men who were thieves, that he had no family living to clear his name, and that he asked only that whoever found his record should see that the truth of it reached the one person he had wronged by his silence. There had been a young drover, the keeper wrote, a man named Tom Eddy, who had crossed the bridge with a herd in the autumn of 1866, and had been accused by the company of passing 40 head without paying the toll, and had been jailed for it on the strength of the keeper's collections being short that season, and had lost his herd and his name over a shortfall that was the company's theft and not the drover's fraud. The keeper had been too afraid of the company to speak for him at the time. He had carried it ever since. Make it right. The letter ended. I could not make it right for the Eddy boy if he lives, and for his people if he does not. The strong box, when she finally worked its rusted lid free with the pry bar and a careful hour, held a little over $600 in coin and small notes. It was not a fortune. It was the savings of a frugal man across a frugal life, and it was also, the ledger proved, less than a third of what the company had stolen from him. It was enough, even so, to do what the letter asked, and Adelaide had not opened the wall to make herself rich. She had opened it to prove that a wall could lie and a record could not, and now that the record was in her hands, she knew exactly what her grandfather would have her do with it. She did not go to the company. A young woman with no standing and a dead man's ledger would have been laughed out of any office the company owned, and the ledger would have vanished the moment it left her hands. She went instead to the people the theft had touched, one at a time, the way a mason lays a wall, one true stone set firmly before the next is lifted. She went first to find Tom Eddy. It took her the better part of a month. She rode to Halloran Crossing and asked the storekeeper, who knew everyone's people, and the storekeeper leaned on his counter and named over the Eddys he could recall, an old man dead these 6 years, a daughter married off to a freighter in New Mexico, and a son, he thought, who had gone to herding sheep up in the high country, after some old trouble that had cost him his standing, a man nobody had heard speak of his own affairs in years. He sent her to a sheep camp 3 days' ride into the high country, where a man of the right age and the right name was said to herd for wages, having no herd of his own. She found him there on a cold, bright afternoon, A lean, weathered man, past 40 now, standing among his employer's animals with a dog at his heel, and a look that said he had learned long ago to expect nothing good from anyone who came up the trail looking for him by name. He spent 13 years working other men's animals because his own name had been ruined by a charge he had never been able to disprove. She did not tell him a story. She showed him the ledger, open to the autumn of 1866, where the keeper had recorded Tom Eddy's 40-head crossing and the full toll, paid in coin, on a date the company's books had erased. She showed him the company's own receipt for that month, short by exactly the sum of his toll and a dozen others. And she showed him the keeper's letter, and she watched a man who had been called a thief for 13 years, read in a dead man's hand the words that said he had told the truth all along. He did not weep, though his hands were not steady. He read the letter 3 times, and then he folded it with great care along the creases the keeper had made, and he handed it back to her, and he said only that he had wondered all these years whether he had remembered it wrong, whether he had somehow done the thing they said. To be told, he had not, he said, his voice rough, was worth more than the herd. Adelaide told him the rest could be made worth more than that, too, if he would help her, and for the first time in 13 years Tom Eddy had a reason to ride down out of the high country. What followed was not a confrontation and not a trial in the dramatic sense, and the story would be false if it pretended otherwise. It was the slow, patient assembly of proof, the laying of a wall. Adelaide and Tom together took the ledger and the receipts to a land lawyer in the county seat at Rico, a careful elderly man named Hartwell who handled deeds and probate and who had no love for the freight company which had cheated half the county in its day before it failed. Hartwell received them in an office that smelled of dust and ink and old paper, and he listened to Adelaide lay the matter out plainly, without heat, the way her grandfather laid stone. And when she set the ledger open on his desk and turned the oil lamp toward it, she watched his manner change from the patience a busy man shows a stranger to the stillness of a man who has seen something he cannot set aside. He examined the ledger for 3 days. He compared the keeper's hand across 11 years and found it consistent, the loops and the pressure of the pen the same in 1866 as in 1877, no later forgery and no inserted page. He laid the company's receipts beside the keeper's record and made his own column of the difference, adding it on a long sheet, in his own careful figures, and the difference came to a sum that made even his dry old face go still. He set down his pen when he reached the bottom of the column, and he looked at the two of them across the desk and said, in the flat voice of a man stating a fact he has tested, that he had practiced law in the territory for 30 years and had rarely seen theft so patiently documented by the man it was committed against. The company itself was gone, dissolved in bankruptcy, years before, its principals scattered. The men who had run it were not all gone, however, and one of them, a former agent named Loomis, who had grown comfortable on the proceeds and now sat on the board of a bank in Durango, was very much alive and very much within reach of a court. Adelaide did not want Loomis humiliated. She wanted Tom Eddy's name cleared and the keeper's truth on the record. And she wanted, if the law would allow it, restitution for the man who had lost his herd. Hartwell told her that the keeper's ledger, properly entered into evidence with the receipts, would be very difficult to argue against, and that the law had a long memory for fraud even when the company that committed it had ceased to exist. He filed the papers, he entered the ledger, and the case, when it came, was decided not by a speech or a dramatic unmasking, but by the quiet weight of a dead man's careful accounting laid open on a courtroom table, 11 years of true figures against a company's falsified books, impossible to explain away. Loomis was not present to be confronted. He had his lawyers file what they could, and then, when the ledger was admitted and the columns compared, he settled rather than be tried, paying into the court a sum to be distributed to those the company had wronged, and resigning his seat at the bank before the newspapers could make more of it than they did. He became in the way of such men when their foundation is pulled out from under them, suddenly and permanently irrelevant. He did not apologize. Adelaide had not asked him to. The proof had done what no accusation could, and the proof had cost him more than any apology, and she found she did not need to watch him fall to know that the wall had told the truth in the end. Tom Eddy's name was cleared by order of the court in the spring of 1880. The record of his conviction was struck. From the settlement he received enough to buy a small band of sheep and the lease of a grazing allotment in the high country he had worked for others all those years, and he became, in his middle age, a man with his own animals and his own name, and a deed with no lie in it. He came to see Adelaide before he drove his new band up into the hills, and he brought her awkwardly a thing he had made over the winter, a small wooden box dovetailed at the corners with the kind of patient care a man learns in the long hours of a sheep camp. He told her it was for her tools. He said a person who kept tools like hers ought to keep them in something better than a feed sack. She kept her grandfather's chisels in that box for the rest of her life. The money in the strong box she did not keep either, or not most of it. The keeper's letter had asked her to make it right, and she had read enough of his record to know that making it right meant more than clearing one man. She gave the bulk of the $600 to Hartwell to be added to the court's distribution, so that it went to the heirs of others the company had cheated, the small farmers and drovers, whose names appeared shorted in the ledger's columns. She kept only enough to do the one thing the keeper had not asked for, but would, she believed, have wanted. She kept enough to rebuild his wall. For that is what she did in the end, and it is where the story comes to rest. She did not tear the shack down for its timber as the blacksmith had assumed she would. She did not sell the shelf or the deed. She moved into the keeper's shack above the dead crossing, and over the summer of 1880 she made it whole. She rebuilt the fallen roof with timber she hauled up the shelf a length at a time, setting the rafters herself and pegging them as her grandfather had shown her, working through the long, bright canyon days with the river a thin, distant sound far below. She reglazed the blind window with glass carried up wrapped in straw. And she rebuilt the back wall, the wall that had been 4 feet thick and full of a dead man's truth, laying it up clean and true and solid, the way her grandfather had taught her, choosing each stone for its bed and its face, and tapping it home and checking the line with the yellowed level before she ever mixed the mortar that would fix it. She built it with no chamber in it and no secret, 18 inches through where 18 inches would do, because the secret it had kept was out now and in the light where it belonged, and the wall no longer needed to lie. When the last course was set, she stood back and looked at it in the slanting evening light, and saw that it was a wall a mason would not be ashamed of, and she thought that Josiah Renner, who had built the first one well and the second one in fear, would have known the difference and been glad. The townspeople came around in the slow way of people who have laughed at someone and been proven small. The widow Pruitt, who had told her she had bought a heap of falling rock, came out to the shelf one day with the pie and looked at the rebuilt shack and the cleared yard, and the woman who had made them, and said only that she had been wrong about the rock, and that was as near to an apology as the widow had in her. Coyle, the blacksmith, who had said she would not get a wagon up the shelf, built her a better road up it the next year for the price of materials, which from Coyle was something like reverence. None of them ever heard her say that she had told them so, because she never said it. The work had said it, the wall had said it. She let them be. Adelaide Voss lived above the Dolores Crossing for many years, and the canyon people, who had a long memory for those who proved themselves, stopped calling it the toll-keeper's ruin and began calling it the Voss place, and then simply Adelaide's, and the young women of the county who found themselves turned out or dismissed or counted as nothing learned. The way such things are learned in a country without many books, that there was a woman up on the shelf who would teach a person to read stone, and to mend a wall, and to wait out the men who laughed, and to trust the patient work of the hands over the loud verdict of the crowd. She kept her grandfather's tools in Tom Eddy's box on a shelf by the rebuilt wall, The stonemason's hammer with the worn hickory handle hung on a peg above it where her hand could find it in the dark. And on the evenings when the canyon light came in low and gold through the red-glazed window and lay across the true, clean face of the wall she had built, she would sometimes set her palm flat against the stone the way she had the first morning when it had told her it was hiding something, and she would feel nothing now but cold, honest rock, a wall that kept no secret, a thing made right at last by hands that the world had thrown away, and that had turned out to be the only hands that knew how to read it. The hammer is still on the peg. The box is still on the shelf. And the wall, the one they all said was solid, the one that was never solid at all, stands true above the crossing to this day, holding nothing back, which is the only honest thing a wall can do. If you have ever been counted as nothing by someone who never once looked closely at what you could do, tell me where you were when you decided to keep working anyway. And if this story stayed with you, there is another like it waiting, about a woman and a thing the world threw away, and the truth that was sealed inside it,